Hello and welcome to this video on monopoly. So in this video we're going to look at the characteristics of monopoly, or a monopoly market. Look at being able to illustrate the conditions of a firm operating monopoly, and then finally compare a monopoly market structure to the market structure of perfect competition. So this is the last in our series of videos on market structures, and we're dealing with this one at the end, the lowest level of competition, monopoly. So here are our characteristics of monopoly. So in terms of the size and number of firms, we're talking about a mono, only one firm in the industry, or we sometimes broaden the definition slightly to talk about a particular dominant firm in a market. There are high barriers to entry and exit, so it's difficult for competition to join the market and difficult for them to leave. Products are often differentiated, and we have imperfect knowledge. There are no other firms, so interdependence is not really a thing. We assume often that these businesses are profit maximizers and that they have a strong ability to set their own price. The key two for this market are over here on the left-hand side. So let's talk about how we define monopoly. Now, some people would define monopoly as the board game, but of course, in this instance, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the monopoly market structure. So a typical or a traditional approach would be to think of a pure monopoly. And a pure monopoly exists when there is one company that dominates the entire market. There is only one seller in the market. So the market has a 100% concentration ratio for one firm. Now that can be quite unusual. We still find situations when a firm can dominate the market and act like a monopoly company, even if it's not the only company in the market. So a company with over 40% market share is said to hold a dominant position according to the European Union's competition policy. In the UK, the Competition and Markets Authority define a monopoly, or define a firm as having monopoly power, when the firm has 25% or more market share. And so these 40% market shares for a dominant position and 25% share for monopoly power are important benchmarks when we consider whether a company is a monopoly or not. Part of this depends on how we define the scope and size of the market as to whether they have 40% market share or 25% market share. So often it makes sense to judge a monopoly on a case-by-case basis. We might look at a global monopoly, perhaps even breaking it down to a national monopoly quite often. You could even have a monopoly within a certain region, and again, monopoly within a local town, for example, or a local area. We could look at it in terms of industry, but we can also break it down by different areas within the supply chain within an industry. Examples might be postal services, the water industry, supermarkets. You might find that a supermarket is not a monopoly based on a national level, but if it's the only supermarket in your town, then you might say it has a local monopoly. So it depends again on how we class a market as to whether we're deciding whether a firm is a monopoly company or not. We mentioned at the start pure monopolists. Now often there are certain industries that just make sense for there to be one large business, as that one large business is the only one that's able to benefit fully from extensive economies of scale. We can see on this diagram here that the industry on the left-hand side is appropriate for firms of a much smaller scale. The one on the right-hand side is what we would call a natural monopoly. At very large levels of output, only by operating at a very large scale, can we lower the average cost of production. So gas, electricity grids, water supply, broadband, networks, railway tracks, these are all good examples of natural monopolies. Economies of scale are so large that any new entrant would find it impossible to match the costs and prices of the established firm. Now, to avoid these monopoly companies exploiting customers, they're sometimes owned by the state, so states often provide gas, water, things like that, so they can make sure that customers are not exploited, or sometimes the state will regulate the private company, produce rules and regulations about what that company can do with its prices. So if you were to illustrate a natural monopoly, if it was profit maximizing, we might find here a price of P1, a cost of C1. and supernormal profits existing. But often, as we said, that the government can provide the service or regulate a company at the prices they can charge, and really the reason being is because we want to exploit these economies of scale. So actually we want to have a much larger level of output and benefit fully from that lower cost. So often we might find a situation where governments will charge a low price to ensure high levels of output. Here they're making a loss, but often governments will cap prices to make sure the service is affordable for many people. So for example, they may lose money operating the national water company, so they can take advantage of these economies of scale and offer customers cheap prices. If it was a private company operating the national monopoly without any interference from the government, you might expect supernormal profits and higher prices. So we've jumped a little bit ahead by talking about natural monopoly. Let's just go for a regular monopoly. So a company that has more than 40% or 25% market share, we would say is a working monopoly. Now here the monopoly has price setting, price making power. So they have a downward sloping average revenue demand curve, AR and MR curves. There's also the potential for price discrimination between consumers, which we'll come on to later. Firms can either set their prices here, be a price setter, or they can set the quantity they're going to sell, but not both. Barriers to entry exist, which allows them to maintain supernormal profits in the long run. So because there is no threat of competition entering the market to compete away the supernormal profit, supernormal abnormal profits can be maintained in the long run. We assume imperfect information. We assume again profit maximization, but actually this is not necessarily a given rule. Sometimes firms with market power, for example a dominant firm in an oligopoly, will have slightly different objectives. Sometimes their aim is just to maintain their market share, to maintain their position in the industry. So here is how we might illustrate a company operating as a monopoly. We can see they're making supernormal profits, and this may be the case in the long run. So why do we often think about monopolies as being bad? What are the disadvantages of a monopoly? Well, the fact they're making a supernormal profit without being, there's less incentive to be efficient and develop new products. They're doing very well and there's no threat of competition. Often some of these supernormal profits are used not to develop new products, but instead used to protect their position in the market, so to try and create more barriers to entry. If you're a consumer and you have a monopoly supplier, you're likely to pay higher prices and get lower levels of output. Often monopolies will use the profits that they're making to what we call cross-subsidize, so maybe pay for other areas of their business that are making losses. Often monopolies engage in price discrimination in order to reduce consumer surplus. Because they don't often operate at the bottom of the average cost curve, they're not productively efficient. Because price does not equal marginal cost, they're not allocatively efficient. And because there's no competition, they're often likely to be X inefficient. So X inefficient is when the firm is operating at the lowest point of their cost curve, but they may potentially have been operating on an even lower cost curve. So for example here, a business might be operating at this this average cost. They could have, with competition, be operating on this cost curve at this yellow point here. And so we would say the gap in between is the X inefficiency. A good way to remember the disadvantages of monopoly is SPEW. And that's not to do with being sick. That's an acronym for S, the service. Does the lack of competition affect the quality of service to customers? P, prices. How high are prices compared to competitive markets or one that is contestable? Efficiency, lack of productive, allocative, dynamic, and X inefficiency. And welfare. What are the overall welfare outcomes? Often we see there is a net welfare loss in markets dominated by businesses with monopoly power, which we'll come on to a little bit later. Are there any advantages of a firm being in a monopoly? Well, sometimes the abnormal, supernormal profits can provide finance for investment to make the business more competitive. Supernormal profits may provide funds for research and development, which may enable businesses to match large and compete well with large international companies. Cross-subsidization may be a positive if by using the profits, the supernormal profits, the business can bring out new products. Price discrimination may allow cheaper prices for some customers, and economies of scale can be exploited to offer lower prices. Sometimes when we have two businesses competing with each other, we have a duplication of resources, so two sets of workforce. We can't exploit economies of scale in the same way. So this may be wasteful from society's point of view, and actually a monopoly provider might be the best and most efficient way of doing it. So we've covered off all our market structures. It's useful at this stage to do a comparison of monopoly versus perfect competition. This diagram shows us both. I'd like you to take this diagram down in your notes because we're going to refer to the points on this diagram in the next slide. Alternatively, you might want to print screen and put this in your notes. So let's compare the monopoly situation to perfect competition. We're going to compare it across a number of categories. First of all, if we look at profit, well, in the monopoly diagram, the supernormal profit was equal to the area PMCMBA, whereas in perfect competition, we have normal profits. Output is greater and the price is lower. About productive efficiency, in monopoly, we don't have productive efficiency, not the lowest point on the AC, whereas in perfect competition, we do. Allocative efficiency, no, not in monopoly. Price is greater than marginal cost, but we do have it in perfect competition. The consumer surplus in the monopoly diagram would be the area PMFA. So it's smaller than the consumer surplus area when we're looking at perfect competition, which is PPCFC. PPCFC. So we often see there is a welfare lost from the firm operating as a monopolist, and this is equal to the area ADE. So in this video we've looked at the characteristics of monopoly, we have looked at illustrating conditions of a firm in monopoly and compared monopoly to perfect competition. That's it. Thank you very much for listening.